Welcome to Online Law Talks from the Victoria Law Foundation. I'm Lynn Holtain. Great to have you with us today. And in a moment, we're going to talk about the Victorian Ombudsman and how it fits into the Victorian legal landscape. But before I introduce you to the Ombudsman, let me first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I sit, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And wherever you may be listening or viewing today, wherever you are across this great state, the traditional owners have cared for this land for millennia, and we owe them a great debt of gratitude. Deborah Glass is the Victorian Ombudsman, and it is our great pleasure for us to interview her for this series. You are a very regular participant in our in-person law talks, but thanks again for making yourself available for the online version. Good to have you with us.
Good to be here, my pleasure.
Deborah, we're going to talk about, how VO functions and what sorts of civil disputes that you deal with, and I suppose critically at the moment too, what sort of an impact COVID has had on your work. But tell us a little bit about your story. How do you get to become the Victorian Ombudsman?
Well, I didn't plan it, is the very short answer to that question. But I think when I studied law, I don't think I didn't know what an ombudsman was. It was after the Ombudsman Act had come into existence in the 70s, but if we studied it, I don't remember it. So it definitely didn't cross my consciousness. Like many of your no doubt listeners, I did a law degree, and I started working as a lawyer. And I knew on my first day that I didn't want to stay in sort of conventional law. So I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I stuck with it really until I earned enough money to get out of there.
So what on your first day though drove you away? What was going on?
There was something about the conventional regularity of a law firm that that screamed out to me, this is not me. And what happened, I think, repeatedly over in the next few years was a very strong sense of gender as well. That back in the 80s, which is when this was, it really felt like you had to be better than a man to get to the same place. And although I know that there are women of my generation who certainly succeeded tremendously, I just didn't care enough about what the life of a law firm was, or indeed the life of a lawyer was, and I just wanted to get out. So I basically left on a one-way ticket and a rucksack on my back. And I actually had dreams of becoming a great travel writer.
How did that go?
Well, not well. I realised very quickly after travelling for a bit that I wasn't even going to earn enough money to pay for repairs to the rucksack. So I started, and I just fetched up in Switzerland, where I had family, and I fell into a role as a management trainee with an American investment bank, which is not something I ever wanted to do, but it was there, and I did it. So something about opportunity, So I stuck with that for a few years, and it was a wonderful training ground. I learned a lot about financial services, but I realised quite quickly that I didn't care enough about sort of corporate profits. And when you work in a bank in particular, you have to really care about making money for the bank. So I left that. They had at one point sent me to Hong Kong to work in the local businesses there, and I thought, I like this place, it's fascinating. And it happened to coincide with, this is a very long time ago, the 1987 market crash, when the whole sort of issue of the public interest and protecting investors began coming to the fore. And Hong Kong was setting up a new regulator, and I thought, that's what I want to do. I've got all of this technical expertise in financial markets. I want to use that expertise to protect investors and do something in the public interest. So that began my very long career in the public sector. I spent about 10 years in Hong Kong. I then moved to the UK. I stayed in financial services for a few more years as chief executive of a regulatory body there. And then, for various reasons, that role came to an end, and I got to the point where I had to do something else with my life, my career. And again, this isn't about planning. It was, what was out there, But the question I was asking myself was, what matters to me? And I realized that what mattered was to do something that continued to be in the public interest. I didn't have to stay in financial services, but I wanted to do something that was going to be meaningful. So I ended up in police complaints. So and that was just something about, there it was, there was an ad I saw in the paper, and I thought, well, I'll give that a go.
Which is bizarre, given that years ago, probably before most of our young viewers were born, or when they were very young at least, the Victorian Ombudsman did have a police complaints function, but it doesn't anymore.
No, it doesn't. And it is funny because I did that job in various iterations for about 13 years. And dealing with police complaints and corruption in the United Kingdom often meant you were dealing with some of the major news stories of the day. Fatal shootings and deaths in custody and major corruption scandals, and so on and so forth. So it's a very intense, very high profile role. And it came to an end at the end of my second term as where I was deputy chair of what had then become the Independent Police Complaints Commission. And I was thinking, what do I do now? And I saw for various reasons, it was time to come back to Australia. I saw the ad for the Victorian Ombudsman, and I thought that is exactly what I want to do. So there are times when I've taken on something, I've gone for something because of what it wasn't. It wasn't in financial services, or it wasn't in the private sector. But this time I went for it because of what it was, and I thought, this is exactly what I want to do. And I can't think of a job more meaningful.
The public interest dimension is a continuous thread in this, from the sort of post-financial services period of your career, and I think as you've said, that has real expression here in the role as the Victorian Ombudsman. But tell us what the Ombudsman does in terms of resolving disputes for people, because we think about courts, we think probably about VCAT. Where does VO sit in the landscape of institutions that help us navigate the law?
Well, we're part of that wider sort of dispute resolution landscape. I'm not a court or a tribunal, and actually that's one of the lovely things about my job, is that I'm not. And the thing I like best about it is that I'm not bound by the law. I mean, obviously we're all bound by the law, but I'm not bound by the law in terms of my decision-making in the way a judge is. So many of the things I do, the decisions that my staff make on my behalf, when they're dealing with the thousands of complaints that come into the office, are about fairness. So, there are all these instances where, something. Well, let me give you an example. Here, parking fines. We get a lot of complaints about parking fines. I don't deal with every complaint we get about parking fines. I deal with very few of them, because if I did, I would need a lot more than 100 or so staff I have at present. And if you get a fine, there's a whole series of rights of appeal which end up in court where you can challenge it. Quite explicitly, the Ombudsman does not deal with matters where you have a right of appeal at a court or tribunal, except in exceptional circumstances. But I have a lovely discretion that allows me to do it if otherwise there would be an injustice. And isn't that a nice way to think about these things? So, give you an example. Complaint about parking fines. Normally, we wouldn't take these on. This is a complaint by a homeless man with a disability. He had gone to a conference at a local church. He's got a disability permit. He had parked his car in a place with a disability, with his disability parking sticker. He'd had to leave at some point and come back. And when he came back, the space was blocked by a trailer. So he couldn't park in the disability zone. He parked nearby in what was a permit zone. Goes back to the conference, comes out at the end of the day, and sure enough, he's got a parking ticket. So he appeals to the council about this, and sets out his circumstances, and it's twice refused. And technically, what they're saying is, well, having a disability permit does not permit you to park in a permit zone, which is, again, technically correct. So as a matter of law, yes, you could say they were right, but was it fair? Now, what I look at is fairness. So you look at this case and you go, what were they thinking? Make inquiries with the council, and very quickly that decision is overturned.
So what you have here is an instance where you can intervene, and you did so on what most people would regard as a fairly small scale matter. But the other sort of perspective on the work that you do is that it spans specific instances like that and very large investigations and systemic issues that arise for the experience of Victorians in our relationship with government, because of course that's your brief, is that you investigate activity of government, isn't it?
I have a huge range of functions, all of which, are sort of caught up in, or sort of bound by accountability, integrity, good government, fairness, doing the right thing. And that will range from what in many people's terms is a really minor complaint about a few dollars, but important to that person, all the way through to some of the most serious matters involving potential misconduct, matters preferred by the Anti-Corruption Commission, and major systemic issues about how things happen in the state. So, it could be about our workers' compensation system, it could be about abuse in the disability sector, the way prisons operate to rehabilitate people. So it could be anything from small individual complaints that are important to the people concerned through to major systemic issues involving major agencies or government departments.
So how do I make a complaint?
Very easily. The easiest way to get on the website, ombudsman.vic.gov.au, we have an online complaints form. We've been improving it, so it should take you no more than 7 minutes. But you can also call us. It's very simple. But I would encourage a look at the website, because it is supposed to be user friendly and should direct you through the process. Really, what we want to know, we'll obviously make sure it's in jurisdiction. So I've got a pretty vast jurisdiction, but it is about state and local government. So I don't deal with private industry. I mean, we have people ring us up with complaints that their chips were cold. So or they complain about their plumbers. So we don't deal with private industry. We'll always help you go in the right direction. We don't deal with your phone bills. There's another ombudsman for that. So it's a complex landscape. But anything to do with state and local government, essentially except the police and the courts.
So police, you go to IBAC if you've got it.
Yes.
So that's the internet, police complaints section of IBAC, if you like, and all other state and local government issues you have some sort of oversight of. But if you don't take on the sort of parking fine type issues, what are the sorts of complaints that come through to you that you do action on behalf of individual people?
Well, action, this discretion could apply anywhere. So we will, and this is where, if we think for a moment about where the Ombudsman sits in the legal landscape, it's a particularly important place for those who can't afford to go to courts and tribunals. For those who, like our homeless man with a disability, he could have gone to court, but how reasonable is it to expect somebody in those circumstances to go to court? So we'll get complaints that could be resolved technically in a court or tribunal, where we'll say, I think we should look into that one. So we won't look into all of them, but we will look into some where we think that's appropriate. So there's a particular focus on the most vulnerable. If it wouldn't be fair to expect somebody to pursue their rights in court, we will certainly look at those cases and look at whether that person has been treated fairly. So that's that's part of our decision making. But there's such a broad range, and it could be range from anything from somebody who's in public housing, who's hot water isn't working, who will call us up to complain that they've tried really hard with the Office of Housing and they haven't got an outcome. Well, we can resolve those complaints usually with a phone call. Or it could be all the way through to a major systemic inquiry, a major investigation into something very significant affecting the state of Victoria.
And we'll get to those in a minute. But how many complaints do you get a year?
Well, we get around 40,000 approaches a year, or more. Now, that includes a lot of cases that we can't deal with. That includes the water bills and the cold chips and other stuff that they will say, I'm sorry, but we'll can't help you with that one. But we do make thousands and thousands of formal inquiries every year, and those are the kinds of cases where we are able to get outcomes for people. We do a much smaller number of formal investigations, but in my formal investigations, I have the powers of a royal commission. And that's something not everybody knows, So that means that I have the powers to summons witnesses, production of documents, to require people to attend for interview and answer questions. So they're significant powers.
And these are investigations that you can just determine to pursue yourself, or do you need a bunch of complaints in order to trigger that?
No, I don't. I mean, I have what are called own motion powers, and that means that I don't need a complaint to start an investigation. I can look at a pattern of complaints and go, there's something going on there that I want to have a closer look at. I can look at something that's in the media and say that that's concerning. Let's look into that one, and might make some inquiries and go, there's something here we need to investigate more deeply. So it's the own motion power, I think, is a particularly important and powerful one.
And as you say, I think the fact that it does have the scope of a royal commission and all the attendant compulsion that brings is something that's not particularly widely understood.
It's not, but it is precisely those, and we call them the persuasive powers of it. Because I don't, what I don't have, when I'm looking at an individual complaint when my staff are seeking to resolve complaints, and they make a proposal to an agency about what a fair response would be. Well, we get a pretty good take-up to those suggestions, so we don't, so these are not formal investigations. This is us saying, go back to the man with a disability in his parking permit. That was resolved through inquiries. You look at this and go, what were they thinking? Bring up the council. We suggest you overturn this fine. Oh yes, what a good idea, Ombudsman. So now the fact that I don't use any of my powers to get that outcome, but the fact that you have those powers, I think, helps you. And I think means that when my staff suggest something to an agency about what a fair outcome might be, they get taken seriously.
So what are the criteria for determining what is fair? If you've got, for example, let's take a case of, and I know that you investigated this, some pretty heavy-handed treatment of a young woman at Flinders Street Station, for example, that got a lot of media attention at the time. And I am aware that you looked at that and thought, right, we need to look at this. And you did an investigation into that incident. What sort of process do you go through in your own mind about determining whether or not there is something warranting your further scrutiny? What are the triggers in your head, criteria, if you like, for determining whether or not there's a case to answer?
Well, it is an art, not a science. I think it needs to be clear. I mean, but in that sense, it's not wildly different to any sort of judicial or semi-judicial process making decisions on reasonableness. There is the reasonable person test, of course, that lawyers are familiar with. Mine is a little more flexible than that, so I do consider what is reasonable, but I can express an opinion about whether something is unreasonable, unreasonable, unjust, or simply wrong. It's actually written in my act. And it's marvelous to actually have that ability to say, well, this may have been lawful, but it was wrong. Mm. And how do I determine that? Well, it's what I think. It's why I'm the ombudsman.
On the basis of pretty thorough investigation, though, you're not just sitting
following
in your
the
office
investigation,
stroking your chin.
It has to be evidence-based, and what is crucial in all of the work I do is that it is firmly based in evidence. But having investigated, for example, the situation of a young woman in the women's prison who was in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day or more, having investigated the situation of also of children and young people in solitary confinement across our justice system. There are times you look at it and you go, that's wrong.
And you've also looked at the big systemic stuff, which you've referred to a couple of times, and I'm thinking particularly of the workers' compensation area that I know you've looked at very closely twice, or
yes,
at least written 2 reports. So what's the process there in terms of undertaking that investigation?
Well, many of our investigations they will start with there is a problem here, and that problem might be evidenced by, for example, a pattern of complaints, a spike in complaints, and then we'll see the themes that are emerging from those complaints. So they form part of an evidence base that says, okay, well, what's the question here? So we set terms of reference. What are we looking to investigate? Sometimes it's because something has plainly gone wrong and you want to know what it is. Sometimes you want to find out if something has gone wrong. Maybe it's all fine, but you just need to understand why something is happening. So every investigation is different, but whether you're looking at, and it will be different whether you're looking at a conduct matter, an allegation that somebody has done the wrong thing, compared with a potential systemic issue into whether some of our systems around the state are fair, some of the systems of public administration.
So what happens in the end? Can you force change? Can you require any shift in policy or legislation? What can you do to make sure that the light that you shone on a problem actually results in a difference?
I have some really important powers, and I think one of my most important powers is to table reports in Parliament. And what that means is that nothing can be hidden. The problem can't be hidden. What I don't have, and I think it's right, I don't have the power to enforce my recommendations. And I don't think I should have that power, because I can recommend whatever I like. I've got no constraints on what I might recommend, to solve a problem that emerges in the context of an investigation. And many of with the systemic investigations, the solutions usually lie in either some form of public policy change, reform to legislation, or it could involve significant amounts of public money. It could be building a new facility to house women who are unfit to stand trial, for example, who are being damaged by our prison system. So there are all kinds of possibilities around what I might recommend. And the Ombudsman does not have responsibility either for government policy or the state budget, rightly so. So logically, I couldn't have the power to enforce. I couldn't make somebody spend millions of dollars on building a new facility or requiring or passing a new piece of legislation. So what I do is recommend what I think, and I will do this usually through consultation discussion with the agency or with the responsible minister. Here is the problem. What do you think will fix it? Let's work out something that actually will be achievable. There's no point in recommending something that is just going to gather dust, because you want to achieve change. You want to achieve real improvement in public administration. So I'll make those recommendations, having gone through an exercise of consulting about what makes sense, and I'll follow up. I'll monitor those, and I will. And agencies know I'm going to monitor them. So I have no doubt that those powers are inherently persuasive. The reason I use the term persuasive powers, by the way, is, you know, when you look back on in the debates in Parliament when the Ombudsman was first being set up, there was a lot of talk about the persuasive powers of the Ombudsman. And the fact is, it's a persuasive role. And I'm happy to say that over 98% of my recommendations get accepted.
So you get results.
I get results.
Would you just describe yourself as something of a sort of moral guardian for the way in which state and local governments exercise their power? Is that, I mean, you've used the word fairness a number of times, but there's a certain, you know, as you've also said, element of right and wrong here. So you're making some interesting moral judgments about what's reasonable.
I'd rather be a fairness guardian than a moral guardian. But yes, I'm certainly making judgments based on evidence about what I think is right and wrong, and that comes straight from from the Ombudsman Act. You know, I can determine, you know, if something was unjust, unreasonable, or wrong.
It's a really remarkable institution and quite unique in both its spread of activity, from parking fines to systemic issues, and also the powers that you can bring to bear on an issue as well. Do you think it's got, I mean, as part of the mix, it's clearly got a really strong role to play in amongst courts and tribunals and other avenues of dispute resolution? Do you see it very much as being part of that landscape or standing aside from it?
I think we're part of that broader landscape of dispute resolution. People don't think of us as that. You know, the Ombudsman is a bit of an afterthought, but it's not just about. It's not just that we're, you know, but the reality is we're free. You know, so that, you know, there are people we can. There are some critical distinctions. You know, we can look at non-legal issues. Courts can't. You know, they have to just look at the legal issues. Well, I can look at the non-legal issues. You know, was it fair? Was it reasonable? But also we provide a service that, you know, that is free to individuals. So that makes a huge difference to those who can't afford to go to court. But we're not. You know, we're not the. We're not an alternative to, you know, to the court. You know, we're part of that sort of broader, complex landscape
with specific responsibilities or areas of focus.
Yeah, we're as I say, you know, we're if you've got a right of appeal to a court or tribunal, normally we won't look at your case because that's not what we're here for. So there is there is a very clear-cut place for people to go if they've got a legal dispute, you know, or a dispute that can be solved in a court or tribunal. So we wouldn't normally interfere in that process unless there are good reasons, unless I need to use my discretion to say, well, it wouldn't be fair, it wouldn't be just to expect that person to go all the way to court when they're homeless with a disability.
Deborah, you've been in the role about, 6 years now? Is that right? And you only get one 10-year shot at this, don't you?
10 years is a good long time to have a vision.
But I suppose the point is that the term is 10 years, which is by any stretch, as you say, a very solid chunk of a career. But you can't repeat. You can't stay there ad nauseum. You make, you know, an impact for a decade and then you hand over to someone else. Do you think there's virtue in that too?
In the length of the term, or in
yes.
Absolutely. I think 10 years is a perfect tenure for an ombudsman. I wouldn't want it longer, and I wouldn't want it shorter. I mean, it's or as I say to members of Parliament and others involved in politics, it's 2.5 times a government term. And I think that's right as well, because it needs to be above politics. It can become very caught up in politicking, or it can be seen to be, you know, there's a risk that it will be seen to be. And I'm very, very careful to remain well above it. the advantage of a 10-year term and without reappointment is that there's no prospect, or there's no risk of being compromised, of being expected to negotiate. You know, if you make a decision that's favourable to the government, maybe you'll get another term. So I think it really does put you in a much safer place in a role that can be very high profile and potentially exposed.
And you've had some investigations which have been referred to you from the Parliament, and that has been inherently political. So that's another dimension to your work, is making sure that you remain absolutely frank and fearless, and without, as you said, you know, political favour in either direction or in any direction. Is that challenging?
I love it. I mean, my independence is something I guard absolutely scrupulously, and being independent, being above the politics of the day, not being beholden to ministers, to anyone, but the Parliament in its broadest sense, and the public in its broadest sense. You know, the term ombudsman loosely translates as defender of the people. You know, so this is, and the term for ombudsman in various languages, you know, is often some version of the people's defender or advocate, and it's not an individual advocacy role. You know, I don't advocate for people, but I do advocate for things like human rights and justice and fairness. You know, there's a kind of systemic advocacy, the things that matter, that I will put forward without fear or favour.
And just thinking about the human rights dimension, because obviously that's front and centre at the moment, given our constraints and the impact of COVID-19 on the way in which we live. Has that made a difference to the sorts of complaints you're seeing coming through?
Some of them, absolutely. We started an investigation in June. I mean, I'm sure many people will recall those really troubling images of the towers locked down, brought in with no notice, thousands of people suddenly unable to go out, get access to fresh air, the kinds of things we take for granted.
These are the public housing towers in North Melbourne.
Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, when many public housing tenants suddenly found themselves detained by, you know, chief medical officer's orders, it wasn't so much the detention, but the impact of it on people's rights and ability to do the kinds of things that you'd take for granted. Get food and access to medication and so on. So that's something. So, you know, there are serious rights issues involved in that investigation, which is one of the reasons that I'm looking at it. What we're doing here, what should be done differently to ensure that the rights of people in public housing are as valued as the rest of us. Yes.
So are we likely to see the results of that investigation soon?
I hope so.
Stay tuned.
I certainly hope so.
So given you've worked on all sorts of things around prisons, around public transport, public housing, lockdowns, traffic or parking infringements and everything in between, are there a couple of investigations that you would nominate as being issues that you are really proud of in terms of the impact that you've been able to achieve?
Oh, yes. Where to start? I mean, I will just give you one example, which is a case that I think most people will not have heard of, but it is the one that stands out for me as almost symbolic of the Ombudsman's role. And one of the things that I describe is that it's fundamentally about imbalance of power. You know, that you as all of us as citizens, as we have, when we're up against the state, the bureaucracy, we feel powerless. You know, that somebody's made a decision about your life and you can't do anything about it. So how do you challenge it? Well, you go to the Ombudsman. But the the role of the Ombudsman is to try and redress that imbalance of power. So I guess that this particular case, and it's one I actually feel sad about, because its protagonist was a marvelous 91-year-old man by the name of Alan Lorraine, who sadly died of COVID only a couple of months ago. But this was, he was resident at an aged care home some years ago with his wife, and it wasn't a government home. It was something called a supported residential service, but it went bankrupt. And when it went bankrupt, it took with it the bonds that he and all of his fellow had paid, to the tune of about $4.5 million. So suddenly, these people who had sold their family homes, to support their care in their old age, found themselves with nothing. And it wasn't just about money; it was their independence, it was their dignity. There was a huge amount at stake. Now, Alan Lorraine, who was a very remarkable man, decided that something must have gone wrong for this place to have gone bankrupt like that. So he began writing letters, to all, the departments and ministers, health, and you name it. And finally, he complained to my office. And we began making inquiries, and we looked at the files held by the Department of Health and came to a pretty rapid conclusion that they had, and I described in the report as a litany of failures. So I used my Royal Commission powers to investigate the complaint and the broader circumstances of the collapse of this aged care home, tabled that report in Parliament. And as I said to a rather emotional meeting of the residents of this aged care home the day I tabled it, I can't enforce my recommendations, but I will monitor them. And what I had said in the report is, what is the fair outcome for these people who have lost, everything, lost their life savings? Well, it was pretty obvious that the fair outcome was some form of ex gratia payment to compensate them for those losses. So I made that recommendation, and I made it very clear to the government that it was obviously a matter for them as to whether they accepted it. I can't enforce it. I had said this to the families, but I also said I will be monitoring and I will be reporting on the outcome. And I'm very happy to say that the government accepted that and paid out $4.33 million to those people. Everybody entitled to it got paid, and Alan Lorraine got an OAM for his efforts, which was also marvellous. So there was something for me about that case symbolising the imbalance of power. This 91-year-old resident in an aged care home who had lost everything, who was battling the state. And as the Ombudsman, I was able to get in there to investigate this and to come up with an outcome that no court would have.
That's a very good point. And I think the story also illustrates the voice that you can give to people who otherwise would not have such an opportunity to tell their story and to seek redress. But it's a particularly interesting case in that, as you've said, you don't deal with the private sector. This wasn't a government-run facility, but it was the failure of regulation from the state that really gave you an opportunity to investigate.
Yes, and indeed, I mean, the failures were immense. So it was. I think that the outcome of that was absolutely right and fair, and it illustrates the persuasive powers of the law.
Well, you've been exceptionally persuasive today, Deborah. Thank you very, very much indeed for your time and giving us this insight into the work of the Victorian Ombudsman, and more power for your next 4 years in the role. And I know that that the legal studies students of Victoria are grateful for your time.
My pleasure. Good talking to you then.